Hi, welcome to Jeremy's Tech Channel, and today we're going to talk about what is the Linux kernel. So if you're new to Linux, you might hear, or when you're going through your first install, you might hear and see the term kernel. Which Linux kernel are you using? And it's an important thing that we like to talk about. If I pull up NeoFetch, you can see that the kernel that I'm running is 5.17.3. Why does that matter? What's the big deal with that? And then you also, if you are installing Linux for the first time or for the first couple times, you may get asked the question, which kernel do you want to use? Do you want to use the LTS kernel, which stands for long-term support? Do you want to use the Zen kernel? And you're like, I don't know what the kernel is. Don't know what to tell you. And that's okay. Don't feel bad about not knowing. That's why we are here together to try to help each other understand what these pieces are. So I'm going to switch over, let you read through. This is from redhat.com. This I felt was a succinct way to describe what a kernel is. And no, we're not talking about a kernel of corn. And no, we're not talking about a kernel as in the kernel with Kentucky Fried Chicken. And no, we're not talking about a kernel in the military. It is different. By the way, I am going to do a video here pretty soon, and it's going to be called How to Describe Linux to Your Wife. Subscribe and see what that one's going to be like. It's going to be interesting because she don't get it at all. So here is the overview of the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is the main component of a Linux operating system and is the core interface between a computer's hardware and its processes. It communicates between the two, managing resources as efficiently as possible. The kernel is so named because, like a seed inside a hard shell, it exists within the OS and controls all the major functions of the hardware, whether it's a phone, laptop, server, or any other kind of computer. There is a kernel in Windows. There is a kernel in Mac. There is a kernel in at least all the operating systems that I know. And that's important to note. What is that piece and why is it there? With Linux specifically, it was created by Linus Torvalds. It became something when the GNU project needed a kernel. The GNU project was created to produce a free software alternative to Unix. They were able to produce most of the programs an operating system would provide, but their kernel, the GNU herd, was not stable enough to rely on. Linux is a kernel, the most base level of an operating system, and it was created and published under the GNU public license, a free license. It came to be adopted as a kernel of the GNU OS while the herd continued to be developed, but it remained an external project and is not officially part of GNU. You might hear someone call Linux GNU/Linux, and this is the reason why, because there's a lot of pieces to an operating system, and the Linux kernel is a piece of it. It's just easier to say Linux, and there are other operating systems that operate under Linux that aren't using some or a lot of the components of GNU anymore. It's just easier to say Linux than GNU/Linux, but you should understand that piece. The other thing I wanted to show, this is from the Linux wiki, and this is just a wonderfully defined graphic of what the Linux kernel does. And now it'll help you get a sense of why it's important. You've got on the far left-hand side, you've got human interface, remote, keyboard and mouse, touch display, speech recognition, display sound vibration. You get an understanding of how we are interfacing with the hardware, right? And the hardware, you get supercomputers, mainframe computers, desktop computers, mobile computers, embedded computers. You get the idea. And the Linux kernel is in between there, and it's doing high performance computing, real-time computing. It takes care of network stack, NetFilter, Linux device drivers, Linux file system drivers, and then it interfaces directly with the free and open source and proprietary software. It sits in between. It's very important for that communication process. When you have Linux kernel 5.17.3, like the kernel that I'm using on my Arch-based system Endeavour OS, that typically means because that is a newer kernel, it typically has more updated drivers and support for some pieces that are typical for a newer device. If you have an older computer, some of those things may not matter. But now there are some other pieces to the kernel that matter. But like I mentioned, the long-term support kernel, those pieces are designed for support, security, patches. If there's a flaw or an issue, those things get updated regularly, as well as the new kernel. That's the reason why my kernel is 5.17.3. There's revisions and improvements upon that kernel. One of the reasons why you may want to have multiple kernels on your system, if there's an update on your kernel and you have an issue, you have another kernel to fall back on. That's one piece. In my grub boot menu, I have my baseline newest kernel that Endeavour OS gives me, and then there is a fail-safe kernel as well. I've also toyed around with the Zen kernel, which is supposedly tweaked and set up to be designed for performance. And in my system, I haven't noticed much of a difference. That's an unscientific way to look at it. I'm not doing high gaming performance. I am rendering, and I am getting good performance with my rendering. So for me, maybe because I have good hardware, maybe I'm not noticing the disparaging difference, and maybe I don't understand what performance I'm gaining with the Zen kernel. If someone wants to fill me in or fill us in on the comments, please feel free. The kernel is important, and it's not something that you need to concern yourself with too much. I just wanted to get a sense, if you're new to Linux, I had to figure out, what is this kernel thing? What does it mean? Why do they keep referring to the kernel and this long-term support kernel and the Zen kernel and the most recent kernel? And you should move away from 5.16 to 5.17 because of security reasons. And, I'm trying to understand that. And I figured you might be as well. In its simplest form, it's got the goods. It has got what you need to run your software with your hardware. It's cool. Linus Torvalds doesn't do the updates alone anymore. There's a team that works with him to keep this thing going. There's the Linux Foundation. They are working towards getting this kernel connected to whatever new hardware, whatever new software is available. And that is just super cool. This is a team of people. The kernel itself was released on a public and free license, which made it so easy for GNU to use it as their kernel, which means if you design an operating system, you could use the Linux kernel too. And I think that's how some of the distributions have been used. They may not use all the pieces of GNU. The Linux kernel does a lot of work for you. I would ensure that you have at least one other kernel installed, kind of like as a fallback. Maybe you get the long-term support kernel in there. Maybe you get the Zen kernel in there, just something else besides the kernel that you're using. I know that Manjaro has a kernel manager that's graphical interface on the front end, when you're using your operating system. Endeavour OS has this simple kernel manager as well, which allows you to check for installing and uninstalling and selecting kernels. As you can see here, I've got these options. I've got the core Linux kernel, which I currently have installed. I have Linux LTS, Linux hardened, which I guess is designed for security, and the Linux Zen kernel that I have available to me. I hope you learned something about what Linux kernels are, why it's important, and why you should take a look and see what you've got as far as your Linux kernel. You might learn something new. Take a look at the Linux Wiki. Take a look at the Linux Foundation. Research some of these things and gain some knowledge for yourself. See you next time.